In the name of... If we read just a little bit further in the book of Genesis, just beyond that place where Adam and Eve invent the bikini, things happen really fast. So Adam blames Eve for giving him the fruit, and then Eve blames the snake. And that doesn't work out well for anybody, because then God curses them all. And then God sends Adam and Eve packing out of the garden into a place called East of Eden. God sends them east of Eden. And parenthetically, the fact that the author of Genesis knew the name of a Steinbeck novel is proof of biblical inspiration. Eden was a garden, but east of Eden was a wilderness. There were vicious beasts roaming free, and the wind howled, and necessity forced Adam and Eve next to invent the caftan. So, we find Jesus today in his own, but Adam and Eve. Before Jesus went into the wilderness, Jesus was in a garden. So just before Jesus went east of Eden, Jesus had been baptized by John. The Spirit fell upon Jesus. And God's voice said that Jesus was God's beloved Son. And people began at that moment to realize that a new Adam had been born. That's how Paul describes it in the letter to the Romans, that Jesus is a new Adam. And the clock, the universal clock, was reset. And creation started all over again. Right there in the rivers of the Jordan. Adam and Eve's story and their eventual journey east of Eden, that began in the water too, though it's easy to forget. If you can think back before what we heard in the book of Genesis today, not after it, before it, you will find the Spirit of God hovering above the formless, lifeless, water-covered earth. And out of that water, God drew forth every good thing, and then God drew forth life. And at last, there came the first Adam. And hovered over the primordial waters at the very beginning. And above the river Jordan, the Spirit of God hovered there too. And out of that water, God drew Jesus, the second Adam. And the world was remade, and a new creation began. And now there's us. There's us, God's new creation. This pattern repeats itself over and over in our tradition. This pattern of God drawing new life out of the water. Out of the waters of Noah's flood, a flood that by all rights should have destroyed everything, as the story is written, God instead started everything all over again. And out of the water of the Red Sea, that water that swept over the Egyptian enslavers like a wet tomb, out of that water, God drew forth a new nation. God drew forth his beloved, his Christ, and there was a new creation. And there's so many stories like that in our tradition, stories of God drawing life out of a seemingly dead body of water. Most of Jesus' inner circle, as you know, were fishermen. And there's a story near the end of the Gospel of John about a completely wasted day they had on the lake. Their nets empty, not a single fish. It was as if the water was dead. It was as if, once again, there was that lifeless void. And over the water came the voice of Jesus, standing on the shore, telling them to throw the nets off to the other side of the boat, which is a sort of ridiculous thing to say. And John says that fish came from out of nowhere, and they strained the nets almost to the point of breaking, and there were 153 fish, John says. So who knows, really, whether what John records actually happened that way? But all of these stories about life coming out of seamlessly dead, all of these stories, whether or not they actually literally happened, are about something that is actually and literally true, something that does happen. And that is that God calls forth life in ways that seem impossible and in places. So in the beginning, there was a lifeless void. And at the time of Noah, there was a corrupt world. And at the time of Moses, there was an enslaving Pharaoh. And then in the days after Jesus' resurrection, there was an empty net. And God drew forth life from the water. So, this sculpture hanging over us. It's called the miraculous draught or the miraculous draft. Choose your pronunciation. The miraculous draft is what people often call this story where Jesus tells his friends to throw the nets off to the other side and they bring in the 153 fish. It's often called the story of the miraculous draft, the miraculous draught. 153 of them, John tells us. By Easter, there will be 153 individual sculptures up there. Right now, there are 103 sculptures up there, and 50 more will come at the beginning of Holy Week. And then, Easter time, at the great vigil of Easter, right where that altar is now, right under this sculpture center, water will flow. It will flow over 3 people we will officially recognize back there in just a few minutes. And they will live. God will draw forth life from that water. And there will be a new creation. I don't know what you heard during the reading of Paul's letter to the Romans today. Paul talks about how death, from the one man's sin, death spread through the world. And I couldn't help but thinking of a virus spreading out through the world just like that. And I thought, we are immersed in our lives in so much that is dangerous and destroying and even deadly. But out of the deadly, chaotic, lifeless, out of the deadly, chaotic realities of life, God can draw forth life. God, from the very beginning, has been hovering over the chaos. And God has been drawing forth life out of it in a way that is unimaginable and seemingly impossible. and God can do them now. Jesus going into his East of Eden, Jesus was baptized by John in the River Jordan. We all know what God said to Jesus as Jesus came up out of the water, standing there dripping. God said, "This is my child, my beloved." And then God sent Jesus out of that Eden into the land east of Eden to be tempted in the wilderness. Most of us here today were baptized. And when we were baptized, God said to each of us once the same thing that he said to God's Son as Jesus came up out of the water. "You are my beloved." It's an easy thing to forget in the midst of all the death and corruption and slavery and emptiness of life that in the waters of baptism, God said to each of us, "You are my beloved." But for the sake of the world, we can never forget who we are. We are God's beloved. We are God's beloved children. We are sisters and brothers of Jesus. And just as God sent, so God sends us with Jesus out into the wilderness of the world, out into our own East of Eden, with all of its lifelessness and corruption and enslavement. And it is for us to trust that none of that is a match for the God who can bring life out of anything, no matter how dead and how lifeless it might seem to be.